Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that's been crafted just for you. We know you're fascinated by how different societies, structure themselves politically. And today we're going to jump headfirst into this really, really intriguing and honestly, often kind of messy world of autocracy versus democracy.
Our guide for this deep dive is a 2023 article, and it's from helpfulprofessor.com. You know the one, right? Autocracy versus democracy, similarities and differences.
Catchy, right? And just so you know, it's not just some random article we found. This thing's been peer-reviewed, given the stamp of approval by Dr. Chris Drew, PhD in education. Yeah, we're serious about quality here.
So what are we diving into specifically? We're going way beyond just like those dry textbook definitions. Get ready to uncover these surprising overlaps between autocracy and democracy, like where they kind of blur together, and some unexpected contradictions too. And we've got real-world examples that are going to make you rethink all those political labels we toss around so casually. By the end of this, you'll have a much sharper eye for understanding power dynamics, like really understanding them. And not just on like this big global stage, but even closer to home in your own backyard kind of thing.
But hey, before we get totally lost in the weeds here, let me introduce the expert who's going to be our guide for this deep dive. Welcome. So glad to have you here.
Happy to be here. Let's do it.
Okay, perfect. Let's kick things off with a term we hear constantly, democracy. Our article calls it rule of the people. It sounds pretty straightforward, right? But I have a feeling there's a lot more to it than that simple definition.
Oh, absolutely. The article does a really good job of, tracing the word back to its roots, ancient Greek demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning power. But just like you said, things get way more complex when you try to actually put it into practice. That's where Ruskemeyer's framework comes in super handy. He lays out like these 4 core features of what he calls a fully developed democracy.
Okay, so let me see if I got this straight. It's parliament, elections, government responsibility, and individual rights. Did I miss anything?
Nailed it. But here's where it gets tricky. It's not enough to just check those boxes off a list, right? It's about the interplay between them, how strong each one is, what happens when one's weak, or maybe even like totally missing in action.
You're saying a country could, on paper, look like a democracy. They've got all 4 of those things. But the reality on the ground, the actual experience of the people, might tell a completely different story.
Exactly. The article makes this really key distinction between formal democracies and substantive democracies. And honestly, that difference is essential to understanding how this stuff actually plays out in the real world. Imagine a country where they hold elections, right? But there's only one party allowed to run or the results are rigged. On paper, democracy. Dig a little deeper. Those elections don't really mean much.
It's like that old saying, all that glitters is not gold. But how does this whole formal versus substantive thing play out in, well-established democracies? I'm thinking about the U.S., the article calls it a developed democracy, a constitutional federal republic, and a presidential system, all in the span of like 2 sentences. It's a lot.
It is, but each of those terms tells us something important, right? Developed democracy suggests it generally aligns with those features Ruskmeyer outlined. Then you've got constitutional federal republic, which means it's governed by a constitution, powers split between a central government and states, and citizens elect representatives. And lastly, presidential system. The president's both the head of state and head of government, separate from the legislature.
Okay, yeah, that actually helps break it down a bit. Thanks. Now, the article also mentions this strong tradition of freedom of expression in the U.S., and it makes me think about how complex democracies really are. Like, even when they seem to be upholding these individual liberties, there's often a much deeper, more complicated history to consider, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The article doesn't shy away from that at all. It reminds us to always look at the bigger picture, especially how historical context shapes things today. Take, for example, the long and, frankly, really difficult fight for civil rights in the U.S. It highlights that even in a system that's designed to protect individual liberties, the reality for marginalized groups hasn't always lived up to that ideal.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that no system is perfect. And even democracies with, centuries-old traditions can have blind spots. But let's shift gears for a second and focus on the other side of the spectrum here, autocracy. The article defines it as power concentrated in one person or a small group, unaccountable and essentially acting as they please. That sounds like, well, pretty much the opposite of everything we've been talking about.
It is, in many ways. Think about autocracy as the flip side of those democratic features we discussed. No truly independent parliament, forget free and fair elections, zero accountability to the people. and individual rights, often extremely limited if they even exist at all.
Which leads us to a super interesting case study, China. They describe their system as a, and I'm quoting here, people's democratic dictatorship, which honestly sounds like a total oxymoron to me.
It definitely raises eyebrows.
Yeah.
Right, you're right. Those two words, democracy and dictatorship, in the same sentence, seems like they contradict each other. But that's exactly why it's so important to unpack, you know? It shows how these labels can be used strategically and how crucial it is to really understand the dynamics of power at play.
Yeah, you're speaking my language.
Mm-mm.
So what's the story behind this contradictory label? What's the reality of power in China?
Well, think of it this way. China presents itself as, representing the will of the people, but it's all under the control of this single, very powerful party.
Right, the Communist Party.
Exactly. And the article makes it clear that they're the ones calling all the shots. No other parties can even come close to challenging their power.
So elections, if they even have them, are basically just for show.
Pretty much. There's zero chance for citizens to actually choose their leaders freely, And that lack of genuine political competition, that's a classic sign of an autocratic system. And it goes beyond just elections. Think about basic freedoms we often take for granted, like freedom of speech, the right to assemble, freedom of religion. In China, those freedoms are really restricted.
So when they use this label, people's democratic dictatorship, it's more about, projecting a certain image than actually reflecting how power works in the country.
You got it. It's a textbook example of how a label can be used strategically, both within the country and, on the world stage. And it takes us back to that important distinction between formal and substantive democracies. A country can call itself a democracy. It can even have some democratic institutions. But that doesn't automatically mean they're embracing those democratic values in a real, meaningful way.
It's a good reminder to, always look beyond those labels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to really dig a little deeper to see what's actually going on. But this article doesn't just put these systems in neat little boxes and call it a day. It actually suggests there can be some unexpected similarities between autocracies and democracies.
Exactly.
And that's where things get really fascinating, don't you think?
I think so, yeah. It challenges us to think beyond these simple categories we often rely on, the article talks about this historical context of what were once called, and I want to be careful with this term because it's outdated, but third world countries.
Right.
And, I want to acknowledge that this term carries a lot of baggage from the Cold War era, but it's important to understand this history because it's had a real impact on shaping the political systems we see today in many parts of the world.
So you're saying that some of these countries might have adopted the label of democracy, but the reality of how things work, how power actually functions, is much more complex.
Exactly. They might hold elections, yeah, but are they free? Are they fair? They might have a constitution that, looks great on paper, guarantees certain rights, but are those rights being protected in practice? The article really pushes us to look beyond the surface, to ask the tough questions. Who's really in control? Who's making the decisions? And who's benefiting from the way things are set up right now?
Yeah, it's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion here, right? Uncovering these hidden power dynamics that are at play, regardless of what a country calls itself.
I like that analogy.
And this brings us to another concept that's often, I think, overlooked, which the article touches on, the tyranny of the majority. Have you ever thought about how, even in a democracy, the rights of minorities can be completely trampled on despite all those safeguards and ideals we associate with democracy?
It's definitely something to think about.
And it's easy to just assume those safeguards are always enough. But the article brings up a super relevant example: the historical oppression of Black citizens in the United States. Even though the U.S., considers itself this beacon of democracy, it highlights that simply having democratic institutions doesn't automatically guarantee equality or justice for everyone.
That's a really important point. It shows that we can't ever let our guard down, even within democratic systems. We have to constantly be vigilant to make sure that power isn't being used to silence or marginalize certain groups. And this connects with the work of sociologist C.W. Mills, who talked about the power elite. He argued that even in societies that look democratic on the surface, you often have this small, incredibly powerful group operating behind the scenes. They're the ones influencing decisions, shaping outcomes in their favor.
So even if you have elections, even if you have freedom of speech written into law, this power elite, the corporate leaders, the wealthy, the well-connected, they can still have a huge amount of influence.
Exactly. And Mills argued that this kind of concentration of power in the hands of a select few, it undermines the whole idea of democratic participation. It makes you wonder, how different is this really from an autocracy? Just with a friendlier face.
It really makes you rethink a lot of assumptions, that's for sure.
Right.
So we've got democracies in theory and in practice autocracies with their own ways of holding on to power, and then all these blurry lines in between. It's a lot to process.
It is. And it just goes to show how complex and dynamic political systems really are in the real world.
It really does. So where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, I think if there's one big takeaway here, it's that understanding these systems, democracies, autocracies, it takes real, critical thinking. We can't just accept these labels at face value.
Like you were saying earlier, we've got to look beyond the labels, beyond the carefully crafted narratives, and ask those tough questions. How's power actually being used? Who benefits from this setup, and who's being ignored or, even worse, being actively disadvantaged?
Exactly. And that kind of critical thinking, it's more important now than ever, right? I mean, think about it. We're living in this age of information overload. It's so easy to get caught up in headlines, those little sound bites that don't give you the full picture.
Yeah, it's like we almost need like a decoder ring or something just to make sense of it all.
Right.
But seriously, having this broader context, this deeper understanding of how power works, it's crucial for all of us.
It really is, because, at the end of the day, these aren't just abstract concepts we're talking about. They have a real impact. They shape societies. They influence, the entire world around us.
Absolutely. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening, I got to say.
Uh-huh.
I feel like I've gained a whole new framework for understanding global politics.
Well, that's what we like to hear. It's been a pleasure diving into this stuff with you.
The feeling's mutual. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into, well, the intricate worlds of autocracy and democracy. We hope you've walked away with some new insights, maybe even more questions than you started with. Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning. And until next time, take care.